When upgrading a car audio system, it is critical to not only amplify the subwoofers, but also the speakers for optimal performance. But not all amplifiers are created equal. Having a line output converter built into the amp, plenty of output power, and amplifier tuning flexibility is important. But what if we could combine the amplifier for the subwoofers with the amplifier for the speakers in one powerful chassis? I'm Mark from the YouTube channel Car Audio Fabrication, here today on behalf of AudioControl, and AudioControl has made that combo here with the new LC-5.1300. Let's take a look at what is included with this amp, how to install it, and how to set it up in order to achieve great sound. Let's kick things off here with talking about the specs and doing an unboxing. Now this is a 5-channel amp, that's what the 5 stands for here, which gives us 4 channels that we can use for mids and highs, plus the 1 additional channel that you would use for a subwoofer or multiple subwoofers. As far as power rating goes, this is all in RMS, 100 watts times 4 at 4 ohms, plus the sub channel 300 watts times 1 at 4 ohms, or 200 watts times 4 at 2 ohms, 500 watts times 1 at 2 ohms. AudioControl is well known for being a reputable company when it comes to correctly power rating their amplifiers. I actually reached out to Derek over at Williston Audio Labs, and he provided this here on screen for his test of this amplifier, and you can see that the amplifier beat all of its ratings by about 20%. Big thanks to Derek for providing those real-world tests for us. You can check out his review video of this amplifier at the link down in the video description. In the meantime, this has several other settings that we're going to discuss in detail. Typical AudioControl boxing here, where it has a sleeve, and then if we open up the box, it folds open like so. We get our AudioControl manual, the amplifier itself, and I've already opened this before, so the packaging is a little bit better when you first open it for the first time. This plastic is on there nice and tight. But here's the amplifier with the standard AudioControl cover plate. We'll take that off in a second. They've given us the AudioControl guitar pick on the inside here. We can use this to adjust some of the different settings. And then they've also given us this Allen key, which we will use to remove that cover plate. As far as the manual goes, you'll definitely want to take your time to read through this. In my opinion, AudioControl is one of the best companies when it comes for writing their manuals. They're entertaining, they're easy to understand, and what I really like is they'll show different examples of the system setup. Here's an example if you were using the factory system with speaker level inputs into the amplifier, and they even give you some suggested settings on all of these different dials. As another example, here's if we were to tri-amp our system, again using a factory radio. Here's if we were to use their new ACX-BT1. I'll be telling you guys more about that in the future. The point is here, I really like that the manual shows you some of these different options and the connections that you need to make. It makes it a lot easier to understand. Let's undo the set screws here on the side and get this cover out of the way so we can take a closer look at the amp. With that cover plate removed, you can see that there's a lot of different settings here, and this is one of the main benefits of using an AudioControl amplifier. Not only are these extremely efficient and have great power output, we have all of these different settings so that we can truly control the audio. See what I did there? Jokes aside, there's a ton of setup and system option flexibility here, and I know it can be kind of intimidating up front, but not to worry, we're gonna run through what each of these is, and once you understand, it's not that big a deal. We're gonna get into those shortly. Let's talk about everything on this front panel first. So there's 4 30 amp fuses for a total of 120 amps. So on these connectors here, we're gonna wanna use 0 gauge or 4 gauge wire for both the power and the ground. We can see these terminals are substantially sized, so you could definitely get 0 gauge in those no problem. A new update that AudioControl has made is that these terminals now use an Allen key head, which I really like because you can really torque these down, especially when you're using something like a wire ferrule. As I mentioned, the power and the ground there, and then you have your remote turn on lead that's going to tell this amplifier to turn on, but this amp does have some cool features that make us not always need that. More on that later. Next up, we have the RCA wire inputs. These are for if you're doing an RCA style connection from something like an aftermarket head unit or a DSP. You can see that we have front left and right, rear left and right, as well as 2 inputs for our subwoofer. These final 2 inputs would of course be summed because we only have the 1 sub channel out. Next is 8 total channels of input for the speaker level input. So if you're using a factory radio in your car and you need to bring signal into this amplifier, you can connect to the speaker level signal to do so. These connectors are all this plug style connection, which is really nice for serviceability. If you need to remove the amplifier or disconnect wiring, you can do so very quickly rather than having to undo several wires. Push that back in there. Now keep in mind that this gives us a front input, a rear input, a sub input, but also this front high input. More on that later. Next in line, there's a connection for the ACR1 remote level control. That's this guy right here. That way you can have a controller up by the listening position of the vehicle that allows you to adjust the level of the subwoofer. And finally, we have our speaker outputs. Channels 1 and 2 are this top one, 3 and 4 is this bottom, and then this slightly larger terminal set is for the subwoofer. Do keep in mind that the subwoofer input has a minimum impedance of 2 ohms, so you're going to want to make sure that you pick the right subwoofers and have them wired correctly to not go below that value. And then remember that on the speaker channels, each of these is a 4 ohm output, but you could also wire down to 2 ohms on each channel, or you could bridge across channels for more power at 4 ohms. Remember, we're going to talk about setting each of these settings in a second here, but first I want to make all of my connections because we're going to do a test install here on the test bench. Here I have an aftermarket car audio head unit pulled out of the vehicle, obviously, and right now it is connected to these speakers, but instead of doing that, what we're going to do is we're going to take the signal out of our aftermarket head unit, out of these RCA wires, we're going to send it into the amplifier, and I am then going to amplify these speakers using the amp. And then since I have that signal coming from the aftermarket head unit into the amp, I'm also going to use that same signal for powering the subwoofer. After all, it's a 5-channel amp. We can power our whole system with this 1 amp. Do keep in mind for this example, I'm only going to be running 1 set of speakers. These are going to be ran passive, so I'm only going to be using channels of output 1 and 2, but obviously this amplifier has 4 total channels of output, so I could obviously have 2 sets of speakers, 4 channels of output. Install-wise, you first want to mount the amplifier securely in the vehicle using these 4 different mounting locations. Next up, we connect our power and ground wire, and you want to use 4 or 0 gauge, and of course you want to make sure that the power lead is properly fused with typical installation techniques. Next up, I need to connect the remote in, and in this case, since I'm using an aftermarket head unit, I have the remote in that comes from that. That will tell this amplifier to turn on and off, but it's definitely worth noting that this amplifier has AudioControl's GTO signal sense. GTO stands for Great Turn On, and what that means is if we weren't using an aftermarket amplifier, let's say that we were using a factory radio, odds are it's harder to come by a remote turn on. To solve that issue, what this amplifier does is when you connect the speaker level signal here, it will detect when music is playing and that signal is coming in, and the amplifier will then know to turn on without having that wire connected. The other thing that's nice about that GTO feature, if you were using it and it was turned on for that application, this then becomes a remote out. That's why it says remote in/out. If you're using that, you would then have a 12-volt switched source that you could use here, and that way you could tell other devices in your system when to turn on based on when this amplifier is on. Let's get that remote wire connected. The next part of our install is we need to bring signal into this amplifier. In this case, I have the aftermarket head unit, so I'm going to be connecting RCA line levels. Now you'll notice that I'm only going to use 1 signal coming in, and that's because this amplifier has signal summing. What we can do on this amp, let's say we're only using the front inputs, channels 1 and 2, we can also tell it that we want 3 and 4, these outputs over here, to come from channels 1 and 2 by flipping this switch here from separate to sum. We can do the same for 5 and 6, which is technically the subwoofer channel. We'll change that from separate to sum as well. So now whatever signal is coming in on 1 and 2 is not only going out on channels 1 and 2, but also 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. The same thing applies if you were using a factory system and bringing the speaker level signal into this amplifier. If you only had it on channels 1 and 2, you could do the same thing. Another option is you could bring in channels 1 and 2 along with 3 and 4. That way you have a separate front and back signal. That way you retain your fading capabilities. You could turn off this switch to separate, and then your subwoofer is going to play whatever is on the back channel pair by leaving this set to sum. Earlier I mentioned this extra set of inputs for the front high, and you'll see that we have level control for that right here. What's nice about having that additional set of inputs for when you're using a speaker level signal is some vehicles have door chimes and other things brought in on a certain channel, and then that way you could turn down that particular channel so that you don't have a super loud chime. Additionally, there's a lot of radar detectors and other devices that we might want to take the audio signal out of and sum them into our system, and we could use that high level to bring it on in. The final install connections to make are of course for the ACR1, since I want to have that remote subwoofer control, and then I also need to connect my speaker wires and my subwoofer wires. All of our connections are ready to go. It is always a good idea to unplug your speakers and your subwoofer before we do the setup here and before we turn on for the first time. So I've done that. Let's get our head unit turned on, and on comes that light here. And now you can see that we have this nice blue glow with the lights off coming out of the top of the amplifier up here where the heatsink is. So from left to right, GTO signal sense, we talked about this earlier. In this case, since I'm using an aftermarket head unit and I have the remote going in, we can leave that off. But if we did want this amp to turn on by detecting the speaker level input, we could have that set to on. Next up, our front high level, we could just simply adjust this if we were using it as described earlier. The next thing is our high pass crossover frequency for channels output 1 and 2. The high pass crossover controls the point at which we start cutting off the frequencies below it. They give us a switch here that allows us to control the range. We could defeat this crossover by having that switch set to off, or we could use the low values, which you can see those are the values that aren't highlighted with the white paint there. So low values, we can go from 30 Hertz up to 300 Hertz, or we could set it to the high values and have adjustment from 500 Hertz up to 5 kilohertz. In my case here, for these speakers, I'm going to use a 70 Hertz setting. So I have this switch set to low, and you can see that the dial, if we adjust it here, we can go back and forth obviously. I'm just going to adjust it so it is at that 70 Hertz setting. For this switch, we can pick between mono and stereo. If we were bridging the output, we would want to use mono, but in this case, since I'm using a separate speaker on the left and right, we will leave it on stereo. Now to set the gain. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what the gain control is, this is not a volume knob. In layman's terms, what this is for is the input signal coming into our amplifier can be different strengths depending on what source we are using. So the gain allows us to adjust the sensitivity of the amplifier to the strength of that input signal. What's really cool about this amplifier is it has these 4 lights right here, which will allow us to set our gain properly. So what I've done is I've disconnected those, and I'm now playing a 40 Hertz test tone, and I have the volume set at 0 on the source unit. And what I want to do is I want to slowly step up the volume and monitor this light here, the MLIC source clipping. So over here, I'm going to be clicking my finger up. I'm going to keep going up until we see that light illuminate right there. So I want to remember, so this is at volume setting 34, so I want to avoid going above 34. See, 33, there's no light. If I click up one, 34, there's a light. So we are never going to exceed the volume setting of 33. We want to avoid that because clipping can destroy speakers, and in general, it just doesn't sound good. So we're going to leave it on this volume setting of 33, and because for this channel pair, I'm using mids and highs, I want to use a 1 kilohertz test track. So in this case, I have that on track number 2, and the gain is set all the way down. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to slowly rotate this, and if you watch that maximized 1, 2, we're going to wait for that light to come on. So it came on right there. So what I can do is I'm going to back off slightly on that control, very slightly, until that light turns off. So now my gain control is accurately set to match the output of our source. Moving on, we covered this switch earlier for summing. That tells it that we want to use channels 3 and 4 output from inputs 1 and 2 by linking them together. But otherwise, all the settings here are the same as what we just covered for channels 1 and 2. The only difference being for channels 3 and 4, we have a little bit more flexibility with our crossover, where we can again defeat the crossover. We could again use just a high pass crossover like we did on this first one, or we could do a band pass crossover, which basically combines both a high pass and low pass crossover so that we're limiting both the low end and high end side of the frequency output. In order to set the gain, we would do that same process, but we would just monitor this light instead for maximized 3/4. So now moving on to this next group here, again, there's another summing switch, but this is for Accubase. Our example head unit here is an aftermarket head unit, so we don't have this issue, but sometimes with factory head units, what they will do is as you turn up the volume of your system, it will actually make it so that the bass performance rolls off. And they do that to protect the inexpensive stock speakers that cannot handle the bass. So what Accubase does is it detects this roll off and it will actually bring that bass back in. So these settings here allow us to turn on that functionality if we need it. The threshold allows us to detect at what point that bass starts rolling off so that it knows to introduce bass back into the system, and then the level controls how much bass is introduced back into the system. Again, because we're using the aftermarket head unit in this case, we don't need to worry about that, but if we were using those speaker level inputs from a stock system, that's definitely something you're going to take advantage of. Our final settings here are for the final channel of output, which is our subwoofer. Again, we have a crossover frequency. This is going to be a low pass crossover, so everything below whatever we set this at is what we're going to hear frequency wise. So in this case, I use 70 Hertz, which gives me a good roll off between the speakers and the subwoofers. And we again have a gain control here that we can set. So we've got a bass test tone playing 40 Hertz there on the head unit, and we can turn up this gain until we see that light illuminate and slowly back off. We are good to go. This amplifier is completely tuned for our current system and ready to go. So let's turn the volume on our source here all the way back down, and we want to make sure that we're no longer playing test tones. Now that we have everything completely set up, everything is connected, everything's plugged back in, let's listen to a couple of royalty-free tracks. My friends, this amplifier sounds awesome. Tons of power on tap. The dyno results 672 watts at 2 ohms coming out of the subwoofer channel. Definitely can get down, especially on music that is not royalty free. You can see a little example of that here. That subwoofer is really getting down. So as you can imagine, with one subwoofer or multiple, you definitely have plenty of power there on tap. And then again, you have that full 4-channel output so that you can power 4 different speakers, or you can do those different combinations that we talked about, kind of showed off in the manual. And with all those different configurations, you have tons of different setting flexibility that you can do here in order to tune this amplifier and make it sound great. I love that the footprint here matches the other amplifiers in AudioControl's lineup. Definitely a solid contender here, especially since you have this all-in-one amp system. You can have one amp and have a really nice setup. I definitely recommend checking this amplifier out. So next time you're picking out gear for a car audio system and you need an amplifier that is simple yet feature-packed and very powerful, all combined into one chassis, definitely check out the AudioControl LC-5.1300. Learn more about this amplifier at the links down in the video description. Again, I'm Mark from the YouTube channel Car Audio Fabrication here on behalf of AudioControl, and I'd like to thank you for watching.